I'm Susan Yockey with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, the U.S. is to work closely with Jordan on Mideast peace talks.
The Jordanians have taken great leadership on this issue, and we very much appreciate their direction on this issue.
Syria's religious minorities are wary of the uprising in their nation. Iraq is facing many challenges after the U.S. military withdrawal. And a look at efforts to get a new domestic violence law in Lebanon. It's all ahead on The Voice of America. President Barack Obama says the United States will consult closely with Jordan to advance peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. VOA's Kent Klein reports from the White House, where the president met Tuesday with Jordan's King Abdullah.
After the meeting, President Obama thanked the Jordanian monarch for hosting Israeli and Palestinian negotiators in 3 meetings this month. The president said he would stay in close contact with the king, and he offered any help necessary in bringing the two sides back to the talks.
We talked about the importance of us continuing to consult closely together to encourage the Palestinians and the Israelis to come back to the table and negotiate in a serious fashion, a peaceful way forward. And the Jordanians have taken great leadership on this issue, and we very much appreciate their direction on this issue.
King Abdullah said the latest effort to get the talks moving again is just underway.
Although this is still in the very early stages, we have to keep our fingers crossed and hope that we can bring the Israelis and the Palestinians out of the impasse that we're facing, and we're in coordination on a regular basis with the president as well as with his administration.
The meetings in Jordan are supported by the International Quartet of Mideast peace negotiators, the United States, Russia, the United Nations, and the European Union. The quartet hopes the Israelis and Palestinians can reach an agreement by the end of the year. But the talks have stagnated for some time, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Monday that the Palestinians are not ready to restart negotiations. President Obama said much has changed in the Middle East since his previous meeting with King Abdullah last May. He mentioned the new governments in Egypt and Libya and the bloodshed in Syria.
Unfortunately, we're continuing to see unacceptable levels of violence inside that country, and so we will continue to consult very closely with Jordan to create the kind of international pressure and environment that encourages the current Syrian regime to step aside.
The president thanked King Abdullah for being the first Arab leader to call on Syria's president, Bashar al-Assad, to step down. As reform efforts move through Middle Eastern countries, Mr. Obama said the king has been ahead of the curve in trying to respond to the legitimate concerns and aspirations of his own people. The president said he and the king discussed Iran and Iraq, but he did not elaborate. Kent Klein, VOA News, the White House.
Russia says it will not allow the deployment of foreign troops in Syria as the UN Security Council debates how to stop the bloodshed of the 10-month uprising against President Bashar al-Assad. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said today that if someone wants to use force, such a move will not be done with any authorization from the UN Security Council. Lavrov said Russia stands against violence no matter where it comes from, including the anti-government movement.
Известно также, и это никем не опровергается, что в Сирию поступает оружие.
Lavrov told reporters today that arms are being delivered to Syria for militants and extremists who are trying to use the protest movement to their own end and to carry out a forced toppling of the government. He said that's counterproductive because it will result in spiraling violence. Syria is Moscow's chief ally in the region and one of its biggest arms customers. A Russian-operated ship carrying ammunition allegedly docked in Syria last week. Western powers have been pushing the Security Council to impose sanctions and condemn Damascus for its violent suppression of protesters. But Russia and China have blocked such measures. Jonathan Edelman, Middle East analyst at the University of Denver's Korbel School of International Studies, tells VOA's Victor Beattie that neither Russia nor China seem to care much about how their position affects their international standing.
China is, of course, an authoritarian regime, and Russia is a semi-authoritarian regime. Secondly, they are both looking for allies in the Middle East, and those allies are becoming scarce. The good old days, you remember when Yevgeny Primakov rushed to Baghdad in January of 1991 to try to talk Saddam out of the war, they're long gone. And the new Arab Spring movement really leaves them out of the mix. So I think what we're seeing here is that they're trying to hold on, especially the Russians, to one of the few countries, Syria, with which they have a strong relationship, which they provided billions of dollars worth of arms, and they're taking a beating in the PR area. But I think people like Putin, who are ex-KGB colonels and head of Federal Security Bureau, really don't care that much about public image. They care more about what they see as the hard realities, and they believe, as you saw with the likely Russian ammunition ship providing weapons for Damascus, that somehow Bashar is going to hold on. And it's not even impossible they're right. There is an analysis that says he could hold on, although I'm a little dubious.
So many analysts and officials are calling for him to step down and say it's just a matter of time.
Let's look at it from Bashar Assad's point of view. What has he got? He has a couple of things. He's got 11 of the 12 top army commanders are Alawites, and he's got 12% of the population are Alawites. They're largely sticking with him. Most of the Christians are still sticking with him, not because they like the Alawites, not because they like the slaughter, but they're terrified of what they see happens to Christians throughout the Middle East. And then there's some of the upper-class Sunnis. So Damascus thus far has, although recently there have been some explosions, still has been a strong point for him. He's beginning to lose Aleppo. So he's playing on something else, though. In addition to his strengths, including Russia, the Chinese are flacking for him, and he's got these bases, he has one other trump card, and it's a real problem for us, and that is the opposition. The opposition is not unified. The opposition is split about a dozen different ways between Islamic fundamentalists and then even more fundamentalists, and between Shiites and Sunnis and Druze and Christians and Alawites, and they're having a hard time working together because Bashar was very careful to keep them divided. So he's betting that at the end of the day, and I'm not saying he's right, I'm just saying it's important to realize that I agree with those who say he will fall, but it's going to take longer than we think, that they are convinced, especially Christians and Alawites, that they're going to be slaughtered what if this regime falls. Now, we know that's not true, but sometimes in the Middle East it's kind of hard to persuade people of the truth.
On the regional level, you have the Arab League Observer Mission about to end its mission on Thursday. The Arab League is supposed to hold a meeting this weekend on the next steps. And you have Qatar's leader, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, advocating military intervention in Syria. Will that ever get off the ground?
I don't think so. I think the Arab initiative was, for them, a bold move. It was certainly a good move. I think even those of us who are cynical were a little surprised to see how flagrantly Bashar Assad just went out and killed hundreds more people while they were there. But what he's betting on is a kind of Arab international aspect of what he has domestically in Syria, that the divisions that exist among the Arab nations are going to keep them from a military intervention. So I think it's possible, but I would rate it at about 10% that we're going to see a successful Arab military intervention in Syria.
Jonathan Edelman, Middle East analyst at the University of Denver's Korbel School of International Studies. As pressures mount on the Syrian government, those at the center of power are working hard to keep whatever allies they have close at hand. VOA's Elizabeth Arrett reports from Damascus, those so far seem to include many of the nation's religious minorities.
Syrian religious leaders put on a show of solidarity for Arab League peace mission monitors, highlighting the country's long history of tolerance among disparate beliefs. At a meeting in the capital Tuesday, the Mufti of Damascus, Abdul Bari Atwan, said Muslims, Christians, and all other sects are united as one hand. There is no bias, he added, since we are all under the protection of the homeland. The deputy of the Roman Catholic Patriarch, Bishop Luca El-Khoury, agreed, saying the tolerance practice in Syria takes a special place in the world. When Muslims first came to Syria, El-Khoury said, Christians didn't fight them, and the two have been living together as brothers ever since. Both men blamed the current unrest on people not following the path of religion. Arab League monitor Jafar Kubeida, who noted the neutrality of the mission, said he's experienced firsthand the divide religion can pose in his homeland, Sudan. He added that Syria should thank God that it's not that way here. But there are signs that a tradition of tolerance is under stress. Opposition forces include religious minorities, but in sheer numbers are dominated by Sunnis, who make up 3/4 of the population. Many Sunnis are rebelling not only against the heavy hand of the state, but also the 40-year rule of the Alawite Assad family and prominent positions given to members of the minority Shia offshoot. The Alawites have long counted on Syria's other minorities for support, including Christian groups and Druze, in turn guaranteeing them religious freedom and protection, as well as high-profile government jobs. Support for the government can be heard on the streets of the Christian Bab Tuma district of Old Damascus, and not necessarily because a government minder is present. Outside the Maria Mia Church, Orthodox Catholic Bishop Tony Philippus Yazji echoes the statements of other Christian leaders. Yazji says the church always supports peaceful demonstrations and reform, but he condemns the violence as a destruction of the country carried out by paid agents. Part of the support heard among some Christians and Druze may reflect not so much support of the government, but concern about what might replace the current regime. They've seen the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists in post-revolution Tunisia and Egypt, and attacks on Coptic Christians in Cairo. There's also the specter of Iraq, where Christians fled persecution in the chaos following the U.S.-led invasion, many to Syria. The government has played up the idea of its opponents as extremists, but reprisal attacks on Alawites in cities like Homs and Hama have added to the real fears of all minorities. Elizabeth Arrett, VOA News, Damascus.
Are you looking for a comprehensive daily look at events reshaping the Middle East? Visit voanews.com/ME. You'll find VOA's original reporting from the region, in-depth analysis from our Washington team, VIP interviews, online polls, photo essays, and mini documentaries. Bookmark us or add us to your RSS reader. That's voanews.com/ME.
In Lebanon, the Constitution states that women and men are equal citizens under the law. However, women are not protected from spousal or family abuse, economic, psychological, and rape. A small but growing group of activists and NGOs are trying to change this through a new draft law and by organizing a grassroots awareness campaign. But they face formidable opponents. The proposed law is being blocked by religious officials and members of parliament who answer to them. Reporter Jeff Newman in Beirut spoke with some of these activists and the people who drafted a 26-point law intended to protect women from violence and abuse. And he joins me now on the line. Welcome, Jeff.
Hi, thank you.
What can you tell us about the law?
Well, it was approved in the spring of 2010, the original draft, under the government of then Prime Minister Saad Hariri, but his government was toppled last January. So there is a parliamentary subcommittee now that is working on it, but there seems to be very little progress. There's no transparency whatsoever in the subcommittee's actions, and they were supposed to be finished by last summer. They meet on a weekly basis and have balked at three key provisions included in the draft law, those that would criminalize economic and psychological abuse, as well as marital rape.
Why are leading religious figures in Lebanon opposed to such a law?
Well, the leading Sunni Muslim authority in Lebanon, Dar al-Fatwa, as well as top Shia Muslim officials, have condemned the draft law because they fear it will take away from the power of religious courts to handle domestic matters, as they always have here. And the politicians in the country must ultimately answer to these religious figures.
Can you give us a sense of the level of awareness among Lebanese of domestic abuse in the country?
I think awareness is certainly growing, but it is slow and undoubtedly long process. Activists and NGOs have launched media campaigns that includes television ads, print ads, and last Saturday they staged a march from the Ministry of Interior to the Parliament in downtown Beirut. The turnout was pretty substantial, and they seem to be gaining steam, but like I said, they have a long way to go.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. Appreciate your insight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's reporter Jeff Newman speaking with us from Beirut, Lebanon. The leader of Iraq's main Sunni-backed political coalition says Iraq needs a new prime minister or new elections to prevent the country from sliding into a sectarian war. Speaking today at a meeting of his Iraqia alliance, Ayad Alawi blamed the country's political crisis on the Shiite-led government of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, accusing it of deliberately fueling sectarian tensions. Iraqia joined Mr. Maliki's mainly Shiite National Alliance in a national unity government at the end of 2010. But the Sunni-backed coalition has been boycotting Parliament and the cabinet since last month in protest at Mr. Maliki's perceived monopolization of power in Shiite hands. The boycott has further increased sectarian tensions in the country. Almost 9 years of war. After that, U.S. combat troops are no longer in Iraq. In this report from Washington, VOA senior correspondent Andre Dineshna spoke with 3 former high-ranking U.S. government officials about challenges facing Iraq now that the U.S. is no longer there.
The last American soldier left Iraq last month, leaving behind a country that President Barack Obama described as sovereign, stable, and self-reliant. The U.S. withdrawal fulfills a promise made by President Obama. In addition, the pullout was a subject of debate, with Iraqi leaders wanting a U.S. contingent to stay in place. But the Iraqi government refused to grant these troops immunity from prosecution under Iraqi law, as requested by Washington. Since the U.S. withdrawal, Iraq has been facing an escalating political crisis and has been the scene of numerous bombings. Nevertheless, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta sounded a positive note, saying the United States is confident the Iraqi government and security forces are capable of dealing with security threats. However, former Defense Secretary William Cohen disagrees.
I don't think Iraq is capable at this point of defending itself from external threats or necessarily coping those within. They don't have the air defense systems, they don't have the air assets, they don't have the ground assets, they don't have the counterintelligence capability that we supplied. So I think that it's going to be a challenge for them.
Cohen concedes that some U.S. troops will stay in the area.
We will redeploy some of our forces to other countries in the region, but it's not the same as being on the spot and being able to come to their assistance at a moment's notice.
Former National Security Advisor General Brent Scowcroft says U.S. troops should have stayed longer in Iraq.
Because I think Iraq still has a difficult time getting itself together and making the compromises that are necessary to have a functioning system. Those compromises are probably easier to make in the embrace of a U.S. presence, where they're likely to be willing to make adjustments. I'm afraid now that they're on their own, those adjustments might be harder to make. That's what worries me.
General Scowcroft lists some of the key issues facing the Iraqi government.
Compromises on how to handle oil income. What is the nature of the federalism of the system? How do you share power? Those are very difficult issues, and to make the necessary concessions is easier when we were there.
Former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations John Bolton sees another threat to Iraq.
The influence, the danger, the risk of subversion from Iran, and the risk of a return on a very opportunistic basis by al-Qaeda in Iraq, I think, is substantial.
And, says Bolton, the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq is not a positive sign for the Arab countries in the Gulf.
They see the U.S. pulling out, and they worry about their own stability right there in a dangerous neighborhood across the Gulf from Iran.
Experts say Iran's suspected nuclear weapons program does not help foster regional stability. And along with an unstable Iraq, they say it likely signals a long period of volatility. Andre Dineshna, VOA News, Washington.
This week, a spokesperson for the International Criminal Court in The Hague announced that they have extended the deadline for Libya's National Transitional Council to provide a status update on Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, son of the late Libyan dictator. Saif al-Islam, whom many had described as the presumed heir to his father, was captured in southern Libya in November. The court has indicted him for crimes against humanity, but Libya's new leaders have said they want him to stand trial in Libya. ICC officials want a definitive answer by January 23rd. Saif al-Islam was credited for improving Tripoli's ties with the West. One of his modes of diplomatic interaction? Art. With me in the studio is Washington-based journalist Pete Kobus, who recently wrote about Saif al-Islam's 2002 art exhibit, The Desert Is Not Silent, for MiddleEastVoices.com. Hi, Pete, and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Saif al-Islam curated the exhibit in 2002. Why revisit it now?
Well, although the exhibit was launched in 2002, it continued to show internationally, opening in Moscow, for example, as recently as June 2010. While the exhibit was curated as a mixed-media presentation of Libyan antiquities drawn from a variety of Tripoli museums, antiquities that were shown alongside a range of pieces by contemporary Libyan painters, Saif's own paintings actually dominated the show. Whereas many critics panned Saif's paintings as amateurish, he did have some technical abilities as an artist. Now cloistered from the outside world by the Libyan militiamen who've held him since late November and facing trial, the images he painted are among the few remaining resources wherein we can gain a sense of his voice.
And what, in your opinion, what can the paintings tell us?
It's interesting. I read about the exhibit in the early aughts, and I was struck by the idea that here's Muammar Gaddafi's kid positioning himself on the global scene, not only as a painter, but and kind of a cultural ambassador for Tripoli, but as a kind of international jet setter. He traveled the world presenting his art, and there was a lot of talk of Saif, so-called heir to Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, as this very progressive reformer in waiting. I actually pitched this as a profile to GQ magazine in 2006. The editor loved the idea, but between graduate school life changes and such, I never completed it. Now Saif is restricted from speaking openly with the media and facing some very serious charges of crimes against humanity, so I returned to his paintings and found what appears to be a man at war with himself. Many of the images, and what I mean by that is that many of the images on canvas convey symbols that don't seem consonant with a lot of the political ideas he had been advocating over the years. For years he had been celebrated for improving Tripoli's relations with the West, and yet here were these pieces of, frankly, really bad art that seemed to glorify his father and portray Libya as a country at odds with the West. Not being an art expert, though, I was kind of at an intellectual loss, so I sought out people who could shed some light on the matter. I started by turning to a former professor of mine at Georgetown University, who's not only an art scholar, but runs a gallery here in Washington, D.C. I thought he'd be the perfect candidate, as he has a background dealing with a lot of artists who blur the boundary between art and political activism. Well aware of the Gaddafi exhibit, though, he said, there's simply, and I'm quoting, "There's no point in talking about non-art as art and putting it into an arts discourse language. It can't be done." So having chalked up Saif's paintings to mere propaganda, I then turned to the appropriate authorities, the CIA. I wound up conducting a lengthy interview with Dr. Gerald Post, director of the political psychology program at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, who, prior to his work in academia, had founded the Center for the Analysis of Personality and Political Behavior at the Central Intelligence Agency. As an individual who has consulted numerous U.S. presidents on the subconsciousness of various world leaders, his observations about Saif's artwork are quite eye-opening, to say the least.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Pete.
Thanks.
That's journalist Pete Kobus right here in the Washington studios. This has been VOA's Middle East Monitor. Join us Monday through Friday for news from the region and of interest to the region. Coming up on International Edition, you are what you eat, according to this doctor.
In some instances, I feel that diet can absolutely replace medication.
Thanks for tuning in to the Voice of America.
For more on the stories you've heard on our radio programs, visit our website at voanews.com. That's where you'll find in-depth reports, related stories, videos, and more from our team of correspondents. Or take the news with you by downloading podcasts of your favorite VOA program. That's at voanews.com.
voanews.com.
Online news for a changing world.